and welcome to the Anarchist Book Club with Danny Evans and me, Jim Yeoman. In this episode, we discuss David Roediger's Seizing Freedom, published by Verso in 2014, which gives a brilliant account of the radical upheavals brought about by the US Civil War and the self-emancipation of slaves in the 1860s. I hope you enjoy our thoughts on this work and how Roediger's insights on revolutionary eras can be applied to other events, such as the Paris Commune, the Spanish Civil War, and the contemporary insurrections around the world. Today we're going to be talking about David Roediger's Seizing Freedom. And this was the work that you suggested for the podcast, Danny. Tell us why it is you thought this would be an interesting book to read together.
Yeah, so it's a book that has been on my mind a lot since I first read it. And I suppose it's like returned to my mind recently in the wake of like the insurrections that have taken place in the United States and the reverberations around the world. It's a book about the history of the United States and racism within the history of the United States. But it's also a book about moments of revolutionary rupture and the possibilities that emerge out of struggle. So it seems like a particularly opposite time to be returning to this book. And the book itself, in any case, will always, I think, stay with me because I found it really inspirational and exciting to read when I was turning my PhD thesis into a book. It really helped me think about the Spanish Revolution, particularly this idea that he talks about of how the moment of emancipation, which inaugurates or comes within a period of revolutionary time, what he considers to be, or talks about as revolutionary time, brings together these improbable or previously seemingly improbable alliances between different actors struggling for their own emancipation, and how the bringing to an end of that period of revolutionary time caused a fracturing of those alliances, and that really made sense to me thinking about the Spanish case as well. And it was like a really important sort of framing when I returned to thinking about that period. So I'll always be grateful for this book. And I would like in this conversation as well to think about some of the parallels with Spain and with other revolutionary moments that come across or that like occurred to us both as we read it.
That sort of central idea of the latter stages of the Civil War and the remainder of the 1860s in the US as being this revolutionary moment comes up, throughout the book. It's a returning motif and a very strong one, I think. And there's a quote towards the end that comes from Wendell Phillips, advocate of Native American rights during this time and other kind of progressive causes, when he was talking about one of these coalescences, one of these kind of coming together of different causes, different movements. This particular one he's talking about is the abolition of slavery and women's rights and women's suffrage. And he says that this was a shared sense of entering a revolutionary time. And he says, these are no times for ordinary politics. These are formative hours. And I think that to me echoed with, things that we've talked about in the past on this podcast about the Paris Commune. For example, I think that comes through quite a lot in Christian Ross's work that, this is a moment when the impossible becomes realistic. The impossible becomes achievable. It does quite well in outlining how unlikely it was that slavery would be abolished, even in 1860. How impossible this moment would seem to someone that wasn't living in this revolutionary era. As you rightly say, to me, it's like the core thing that comes out of this book, and everything else kind of spins out from this kind of central framing of the 1860s.
I should probably just acknowledge that I did do a podcast with a friend and comrade of mine like several years ago when I first read this book, and we talked about revolutionary time. And so when I was just thinking about with us recording this podcast earlier today, I thought, it's quite possible that what I say will in some way echo what was said in that conversation. So I should acknowledge Gloria Dawson for that conversation, because it's quite possible that like how I'm thinking and remembering the book now is as a result of like that conversation. But yeah, so the idea of like a revolutionary time changing the parameters of the possible, I think is a really interesting way of looking at history. And it's obviously a very different way of looking at history from the sort of classical understanding of progress that most sort of orthodox Marxists as well as like liberals believed in. So there's a way of like thinking about the emancipation of the slaves as one moment of culmination that proves human progress, right? So it was like slavery in the past, that was very bad, but humans were able to overcome that, and the fact that slaves were emancipated is proof of this progressive line of history. But this thinking about revolutionary time completely explodes that kind of like linear understanding. There's a really like telling epigraph Du Bois writing in 1935. So he's talking about the collapse of the period known as radical reconstruction that followed the Emancipation Proclamation, that was intended to try and ensure rights for black people and voting rights for black men in the aftermath of the Civil War through the federal occupation of the South. So Du Bois says the resulting emotional and intellectual rebound of the nation, so that rebound being the collapse of Reconstruction, made it nearly inconceivable in 1876 that 10 years earlier most men had believed in human equality. So what we're seeing here is not progress. What we're seeing is a moment of possibility, a coalescence of struggles that makes the impossible possible. And then that becomes like barely even a memory within like just a few years, right? It's impossible to believe that in the past people had believed in human equality. So this idea that our parameters and horizons of understanding are constantly expanding as a result of technological advances, science, and what have you, fails to make sense of these kind of revolutionary ruptures and the way in which what we think of as possible is turned upside down, only to be like violently bludgeoned back into the realm of the impossible as time marches on. I think that it's interesting, isn't it? Because progress, like the way that progress is sold to us in something like the Communist Manifesto, is like a consolation, right? Because we can look back on the struggles of plebeians, of peasants, of slave revolts, and what have you, and seeing how they've been defeated, or they've been recuperated into class society. We can say, oh well, never mind, right? Because progress is on our side, and capitalism is going to be overcome as a historic inevitability by something better. So all of those past struggles were doomed to fail, but we are fated to succeed ultimately. So thinking about revolutionary time obviously doesn't allow for that, right? Because progress doesn't hold any promises for us, because we know that progress is about the constriction of possibility as much as anything else. But revolutionary time also holds out some kind of consolation for us when we look back at history, because it shows that regardless of how bleak a situation appears to us at any given time, the impossible emancipation that human beings require in order to save themselves and the planet could emerge at any moment as a distinct historical possibility. And we have to be watchful for those moments of revolutionary time. We have to act as if we appreciate that revolutionary time remains a constant historical possibility.
There's several things that I like to sort of get into with what you just said there. I totally agree on this idea of revolutionary time as being disrupting slightly this kind of linear notion of time. I once gave a paper, I never really wrote it up, at a conference about time that was organized by Matthew Carey, actually a friend of ours, in which I made a slightly ill thought out, but nevertheless I was kind of convinced by this argument that the anarchists in Spain, particularly around the turn of the century, had almost a dual sense of time, one of which was this, progress, linear time. Everything is kind of moving upwards towards greater progress and emancipation. And another was this cyclical, bursts of revolutionary activity followed by cycles of repression. And I think you're right that trying to understand historical actors thinking in that way, which I think Roediger does a really good job of, and that I attempted to do a job of, without patronizing or without kind of saying that this is a pre-modern way of thinking about time in terms of cycles and actually can speak much more historical truth than the idea that things are getting better. I mean, just a very trite kind of example, I suppose, is I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that in the 1860s, black men in the South could not only vote, but voted in black representatives for a time. That legislatures, many of them in the South, were on a very radical platform, that there was an opportunity for something to change, that it wasn't just slavery ended, then it was Jim Crow, then we had civil rights, now we're better. It's not, that isn't the story that's being given here. There is a moment when almost all bets are off, or in Spanish they'd use the term the tabla rasa, the kind of everything kind of up in the air, and repression, almost, comes in as the other side of that cycle. The repressive time, forces its way back in, and they don't go back to where they were before, but they also don't follow this revolutionary time because of this inverse kind of time frame as well. So that was one idea. The other one, I think you're right, that acknowledging this and trying to think about history in this way in terms of revolutionary time and cycles, and thinking about history as though we believe that these moments created possibilities and that we now also need to think about it and reflect on it. I agree. I think that's very important. It does raise the question, and perhaps it's too early in the podcast now or too big a question. But I think in the moment that Roediger's talking about, it is apparent, that this is happening, that this revolutionary time is underway. But I guess, when thinking about it in other contexts, the question I would have is who decides that this is now the moment to, in Roediger's terms, seize freedom? I guess the kind of warning bells go in my head when I think of someone, like Lenin, like going against that kind of very orthodox Marxist view that you outlined about progress being the sort of crumb of comfort at the end of a long grind through terrible things. Lenin saying, actually, no, like I've identified that this is the revolutionary moment, so now we have to go and act. And obviously that's a very kind of limited analysis of what happened there, but it doesn't just kind of having this faith, I guess, in seizing the revolutionary moment as a moment when all bets are off, doesn't remove that worry.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, but I think there's a couple of things to say about it. Really, we could think about Spain, and we could stay on the case of America. Roediger refers a few times to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which was intended to be the first act of a war on slavery. And somebody who I really would love to know more about, and perhaps we could do a future podcast on a book about John Brown, because it's just so fascinating that this person, it's as he puts it, attempted to take the war into Africa, which is an extremely suggestive phrase that I want to come back on later on as well.
There's a really excellent series of podcasts about John Brown's life done by The Dollop, which is an American history podcast that's done by two comedians in quite a good way. So I can recommend that.
Oh, right. Ace. Yeah, nice one. I'll definitely check that out. But it's clear that John Brown's also acting in a way to try and usher in a period of revolutionary time that's not ripe, and he pays a heavy price for that. But it's also the case that his actions, have an impact. They have a resonance. They don't just stop there. I mean, it's made me think in different ways. You wonder really about this whole problem of voluntarism, of trying to hurry history up, and in a sense sort of impatiently acting, what that means. So if you read for example Chris Elam's book Anarchism and the City, which anyone interested in anarchism should do, which is about Spanish anarchists, and when he talks about the uprisings of the anarchists during the period of the Republic, he's quite scathing about these actions, right, which alienated a lot of people, including a lot of anarchists, right? They didn't appreciate this idea that you set a date for an uprising and then you try it on, you attack the police, raise the red and black flag, and then you declare a revolution. That went totally against their understanding of how a revolution might come about, how a revolution would be a product of mass activity and so forth. It's a completely understandable criticism. as well as the fact that these uprisings tended to bring with them a whole wave of repression that then like really obstructed the anarchist movement in terms of its day-to-day organizational activities and educational propagandistic activities and so forth, in some cases for a long time afterwards. But on the other hand, we are presented with this history where people have acted, people felt they couldn't wait anymore, they couldn't wait for the correct moment, they just had to try and do something. And I think we have to try and empathize with that. We have to try and understand where those people were coming from, why they'd been pushed to the end of their tether, and why they thought it was worth risking everything to rise up. And also, we have to take seriously the possibility that those premature actions, or what appear to us as premature actions, made subsequent actions which appear to us as like genuinely revolutionary mass upheavals, made them more plausible, put them on the agenda in a way that they haven't been. I mean, if you take something like the uprising in the mining district of Figols in Upper Llobregat in Catalonia, we're miles away from Roediger at this point, so apologies if anyone listening was looking for an in-depth page-by-page discussion of the book. But yes, we look at this uprising of miners in 1932, in the first like major uprising from the left in the Spanish Second Republic, where people, like desperately poor people who'd been kept in conditions, appalling working conditions, in which everything was owned by the company store, in the words of the song. Company store, incidentally, owned by the Count of Figols, who was a Scouser, who's from Liverpool.
Yeah, everywhere, don't they?
Yeah, they really do. You can't get away from them. So yes, their bid to get away from Scousers was to declare libertarian communism in Figols. And this, although this was like it's a desperate rising, it's fairly easily crushed by the Republican authorities. Scores of people are then deported, jailed, and what have you in the aftermath. But what they did was present the possibility of fighting for libertarian communism as a historical possibility, an option that was then really transformed the dominant anarchist understanding of the time. As you said, there was a strong belief in progress even among Spanish anarchists. And we think about this idea as very strongly associated with something like Second International Marxism. Lots of anarchists shared this idea of anarchism being the end result of a long period of progress. The uprising in Figols, which refused to wait that long, transformed that conception. And who knows whether was in some way like influential in terms of what would happen in Spain 4 years later with the revolution. I mean, it's frankly hard to argue that it didn't have any like ongoing resonances in that respect. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have like the importance of somebody like John Brown emphasized in this book, or the importance of Figols emphasized in my book. But the real story that makes revolutionary time what it is, it makes the impossible seem possible, is the mass activity of hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, the famous general strike of the slaves, as Du Bois called it, and which is really taken up as the sort of central organizing framework with which to think about this period in Roediger's book. So, and again, you mentioned Lenin, but really what makes, revolutionary time exist in Russia, for a good 4-year period at least, is the mass activity of millions of people, or at least hundreds of thousands of people refusing to fight, sending delegations to Soviets and things like that. It's these individual actions and voluntarism is, in a sense, only really given meaning by mass activity. But the exact relationship between them is tricky, isn't it? It's tricky to unpick, really.
It goes back to the point where Roediger actually starts the book. And it's something I've encountered in kind of wider reading. I don't pretend to be an expert in the US in this period of history, but I'm aware that there is this historiographical debate about the question of agency. Roediger gives us this story of what's happened to that idea of Du Bois's the general strike of the slaves, and that's not a term that I'd come across before, to my ignorance, revealed there. But he paints a picture of this being the accepted story, that the slaves freed themselves, that this was a self-emancipatory moment, that brought the North and Lincoln and Republicans along with them, but it was the motion was there. And Roediger very clearly says that this is left academia, to a story of Lincoln, a story of benevolent North bestowing emancipation of the South, very reminiscent of recent arguments that you can see given by people about Britain's role in the slave trade, and these ludicrous depictions of Britain abolishing the slave trade as something as being we're celebrating, despite the fact that Britain established it. This idea of motion, I think you're right, and perhaps my reference to Lenin there was misfounded, because, as you say, it comes after the popular movement. If anything, if we go back to our conversation last time, someone like Emma Goldman would definitely see Lenin as belonging actually not to the Jubilee, not to the revolutionary time, but actually to the anti-Jubilee, to the forces seeking to control that moment, to reset the time in a way that benefits them. So I agree, and that theme of self-emancipation and the possibilities and coalitions and alliances that erupted from it is, to me, really instructive, again, on how I think about revolutionary moments, and to not let our knowledge of what happens to these moments, to the repression of the falling apart of coalitions, to not let that override the moments of hope and possibility and of genuine, concrete change. There's something that Roediger does emphasize throughout, again, is that we need to remember that things were achieved in this moment and not everything was crushed. Slavery, he makes a very clear point that slavery didn't come back as slavery, and it's not correct to view what came afterwards as slavery. It was oppressive, it was terrible, but it wasn't slavery, and he instructs the reader not to lose sight of that. And I think, again, that's something that can be taken to other studies of revolution, and not to just frame everything as a tragedy.
That's an interesting point. Although he does frame it as a tragedy, doesn't he? And perhaps that's something we could come back to thinking about the tragic element in of revolutionary time more generally. But there was a couple of things that you said that I thought I'd come back on. Perhaps I'll try and bring them together. So, part of the problem that we have in terms of trying to salvage what, like you say, what's positive about moments and movements that are later crushed. It's like an act of imagination, isn't it? It's like we have to, in some way, leap from the conditioning of our times, just accept as historical fact the putting onto the stage of history of something that seemed impossible. Part of the violence that crushes these moments of revolutionary time, part of that work is a work of violence against memory and against our ability to recover and recapture and even explain those moments after they've been defeated. So there's a really good bit towards the end of the book where he talks about a commemorative stamp that's put out in 1909 to commemorate emancipation, and it presents Lincoln as this towering figure freeing these supplicant slaves. And he says how it's not only that this is a kind of establishment rendering of what happened. It's this wouldn't have been a recognizable depiction of the truth, of reality at the time, because it was acknowledged, it was acknowledged among activists in labor, women's rights activists, it's everywhere acknowledged that it is the slaves themselves who are freeing themselves, who are refusing to work on the plantations, who are heading north to present themselves to the Union armies, volunteering and so forth in the thousands. So that is creating the momentum of emancipation, that is enacting emancipation itself. It's interesting how he talks then about how the historiography has lost sight of that fact as well, right? So history and memory is obviously, they're not the same thing. But in order for history to do that work of excavating revolutionary time, I think our own capacity to remember needs to be jolted occasionally. And for a long time, we didn't, there weren't sufficient jolts, right? After say the end of the 70s or what have you, there's a long period, particularly as regards Anglophone scholarship, where an understanding of of revolutionary impulses goes out of fashion in history writing, and you can see that in relation to Russia, as well as evidently, from Roediger's opening chapter in relation to the history of America, and definitely you can see it in relation to the history of Spain as well. The revolutionary aspect of the Civil War is increasingly dismissed, marginalized, or even or just treated very condescendingly. And we sometimes require jolts from our own surroundings, our own circumstances, to be able to make that imaginative leap that enables us to recover that historical moment. And Roediger actually talks about how 2011 helped him conceptualize this book, Seizing Freedom, the Arab Spring, the way that spread, right? The way that societies that are traditionally depicted in the West as being effectively immobile and fated to be despotic for all time, obviously, which is a violent act of historical erasure in and of itself, right? And whitewashing of the role of the West in that region. But that was completely blown apart by the events of the Arab Spring and how quickly revolts spread from Tunisia, elsewhere, and then into Europe as well, and into the States through Occupy Wall Street. It's that jolt that enabled Roediger to go back and rethink revolutionary time in this kind of way, in a historical way. It's to be hoped that the same thing will happen with regards to the historiography of other revolutionary periods. And there's a really good historiographical essay about the Russian Revolution written by Steve Smith for the centenary. And he talks about how if we're really going to get back to understand, if we're going to increase our understanding of the Russian Revolution, and not just in a kind of mechanistic way where we incorporate new findings from the archives, but if we really want to, if we really want to increase our historical understanding of it, we can't completely let go of our ability to empathize with the revolutionary impulse, or at the very least, we've got to make the imaginative effort to understand where people are coming from. And this is something that really, will never cease to infuriate me about the way that historical revolutionary events are written about from the perspective of a moderate liberal today, denouncing, extremism at demonstrations or whatever, as if, these were, not that I think those people are correct in the present day context, but, the complacent way in which, this very obviously present understanding of the world is just projected back as if it could help, could feasibly make sense of societies that are undergoing revolutionary rupture. There's a level of humility required, I think, to set aside what you consider to be common sense and possible in your own time and try and understand what is possible in periods of revolutionary rupture. And I think that's what Roediger does so sensitively, so evocatively. And, I personally can't recommend this book enough. Even though it's quite short, quite well written, in the sense of being easy to read, there was still it still took me quite a long time to read it, even the second time around, because I just kept pausing and being sent off on these tangents in my head. It's because so much of what he says in it is really suggestive, and as I'm sure the listeners already appreciate, makes us both think of Russia, Spain, Paris Commune, wherever else.
The way that it makes us think about those examples. One thing that I think really came through and comes through in the framing of self-emancipation as the general strike of the slaves, and this very clear effort that Roediger makes to write this moment into labor struggle, not in perhaps in a traditional or orthodox kind of Marxist sense, in terms of they weren't kind of operating within trade unions or these kind of things, but it belongs in the history of 19th century revolutionary labor history, which it is not a big part of in the historiography. And it made me think maybe it really should be, and not only a big part of, but when you're talking about that jolt, that upending of what is possible, you would need to do more work on this. I would need to back this up. But this happens in 1860 to 1864 and onwards, as Roediger makes very clear, something that is completely off grid, not even within the wildest dreams of radical abolitionists a couple of years before. The idea that all of slavery would be constitutionally banned in the United States. And that this just made everyone who was looking for change in the world think, right, well, what else is on the table? And Roediger concentrates on women's rights and women's suffrage and on the US labor movement. And there's a really excellent section, I think, of linking in self-emancipation with the really strong, vibrant campaign for the 8-hour day. That sort of that sort of common sense, that there are slaves in America. We might not agree with it, but, it's common sense that it exists. No, this kind of cataclysmic kind of event just throws everything up. And it made me think, Marx is mentioned a few times, not necessarily as an analysis way, but the fact that he was alive and present and writing at that time. And this must have impacted, in Europe, like across the world, to think, wow, all right, so like this is off the table. And it's at that point that you see the growth of socialist, anarchist movements. It's only a few years later that you get the Paris Commune. Christian Ross's book starts with the episode of Louise Michel encountering a black colonial soldier on the barricades of the Paris Commune. This moment needs to be much more clearly written into that history, because it's not just echoing. It must be directly influencing people's imaginations.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book really illustrates nicely in a couple of different anecdotes this two-way interchange between the Civil War and the struggle for emancipation with the labor movement, and more specifically with Marxism. There's a couple of different anecdotes that set that off. But I was pleased to see in the latest edition of Insurgent Notes, like an online journal, in the latest edition, it has excerpts from 2 interviews with Karl Marx. One is from the Chicago Tribune, 1879, right? So this is obviously a long time after the Civil War. When Marx is being asked about the political movements in favor of the working class aim for, the interviewer says, so what you're aiming for is the supremacy of labor. Now, supremacy of labor we could imagine to be like synonymous with dictatorship of the proletariat, but the interviewer poses this to Marx, supremacy of labor, and Marx rejoins that it is the emancipation of labor, right? So still, like over a decade later, his understanding of freedom, his understanding of the goal of working class revolution has been shaped forever. The first evidence of that, the rules for the First International, but it's forever, right? This is much later on, end of the 1870s. He's not going back to the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's sticking with this understanding of freedom, which has been given meaning by the struggle of slaves. And in a way, it's a real pity that Marx, he didn't write a book or something about this, right? Because, as you say, it's something that should be a part not just of the labor movement history, but the labor movement's understanding of itself. And the labor movement's relationship to race has been vexed, right, to say the least, right from the get-go. But there is this opportunity opened up, particularly by Jubilee, by the self-emancipation of the slaves, and which in some ways, finds echoes in events like the Paris Commune, as you say, that could have provided a foundation for a non-racial global working class resisting this pressure to become racialized, to accept a racialized status and a nationalized status as well, which obviously went hand in hand. But there are some other as well. There's some other anecdotes that struck me as particularly interesting in terms of this two-way travel of Marxism, because yes, Marx himself is being influenced by this. Marxists are being influenced by this, but also he talks about how German American forces. So there were several battalions that were made up of German post-1848 exiles who'd gone to the Americas after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. He says on page 111, while Irish regiments often received lectures in Irish nationalism in army camps in the United States, some German-American soldiers regularly heard lectures on Marxism. So in some ways, this is a two-way educative process that's going on. One of the most like lasting, I suppose, manifestations of that is the song Solidarity Forever, which right at the end, he provides a genealogy of. So Solidarity Forever, I suppose like most people think as a wobbly song. I might be wrong, but that's, you know, how I thought of it. That was new lyrics provided to the tune of John Brown's Body, which had been, you know, a marching war song of the Union Army. But that in and of itself had been nicked or like adapted from a spiritual and African-inspired ring shout called "Say Brother." So, you know, there's a real interesting... Think about the amount of times that, say, Solidarity Forever has been sung or mentioned or evoked, and how few times it will have been, like, its roots will have been acknowledged in the struggle for the self-emancipation of slaves, and yet how fruitful that connection could still be.
Absolutely. I think that's a really brilliant sort of encapsulation of that mutual interchange, mutual overflowing ideas and practices. And I think that, you know, another kind of thing that comes out of that as well, the Roediger is kind of stressing throughout, is if you're trying to frame it in ways that we might recognize that there are discussions and debates on the kind of contemporary left, you know, it's a kind of an intersectional analysis, or an analysis which takes in regards race and class and gender, is not, it's a natural result of these moments of jubilee or revolution. It's a really obvious thing that seems to happen, that inspires one another, that these things cross, you know, these boundaries that have been constructed and in this case unfortunately return very strongly, and that it's really not an argument to have to say, no, we need to concentrate just on this one particular thing, you know, and then once we've sorted that out, you know, maybe we'll sort out, you know, the other things. The image that he's giving, as I say, is this kind of natural intersectionality of this moment. And I think that again, I think that kind of rings true to there's a really nice quote by Frederick Douglass. This is towards the end of the book when he's talking about the unraveling of these dynamics. But Douglass says, you know, all good causes are mutually helpful. And I think that's a really nice way of kind of framing one of the key messages here that Roediger's given.
That idea of like intersectionality not just being something that, you know, like a trendy word or whatever that informs modern day politics, but also is like a way of like informing an understanding of history as well. I thought that was like one of the most striking things when I first read the book. And all good causes being mutually helpful is also like driven home at a couple of different moments. Partly there's the Karl Marx quote that labour in the white skin will never be free where in the black it is branded. That's echoed by the Daily Evening Voice, this radical newspaper that says the labouring classes will never be elevated without the elevation of women. That's probably not a deliberate evocation of Marx's statement about the black skin and the white skin, but it's obviously, you know, it rhymes with it almost. Yeah, it's, as you say, it's almost natural. And I think this like chimes with our discussion of Caliban and the Witch, that these modern structures of exploitation, you know, this system, this social condition that we call capitalism, rests on racialization. It rests on gendered division of labor. It rests on the nation state. All of these things were constitutive of capitalism with wage labor, you know, as indeed was slavery. And so in moments when the foundations of capitalism are shaken, really regardless of what the dominant theory, be it like radical Republican, be it like socialist, anarchist, Marxist, whatever those theories have to say about the oppression of women or racism or what have you, regardless of that, in these moments of revolutionary time, when the structures of society are being shaken, when they're being overturned, then that involves an overturning of all of those categories. And you could see that, you know, just as clearly in Paris, in Russia, in Spain, as you see it here in the moments of Jubilee as well.
Where that leads, I found it a very hard read, the last chapter, which is that reassertion of those boundaries that you say, you know, were existing before the Jubilee and return in a changed manner, but nevertheless return a violently, you know, reimposed. And I wonder if we need to discuss that. We've talked about hope and the possibilities of this moment, but also, it is a key part of the book, just how quickly those sentiments, such as Marx's, such as the long-standing shared interests of women's rights and abolitionists, they fall apart. They very quickly start to kind of identify their own specific problems as being the problems that need addressing. The question of why, is it an opportunity lost? Is it they got what they could out of that scenario? Is it the self-interest of some actors? I think Roediger makes a point, that big structural changes such as these aren't driven solely by individuals or political parties, for example, but there are key actors that operated basically with their own interests, above the interests of the Jubilee. It's harder to see the hope from that kind of moment. What to take from it now in kind of how we think about the present or how we think about our history.
I mean, we obviously can't skip over the fact that there's a whole chapter called "Falling Apart," which is obviously integral to the story that Roediger is telling. The fact that revolutionary time wanes, that involves a splintering of the solidarities that have been affected when everything seemed to be on the table and everything seemed possible, and people return to their narrower, more sectional interests. And I think that it's clear, like as you say, that this is at once an objective problem and a subjective problem. And I think that kind of brings us back, I suppose, to that, how you conceive of history and time. If we accept that the objective conditions weren't right for women, Black people, and workers to achieve their understanding of emancipation at this moment in history, then that would radically reshape how we understand those questions of impossibility and possibility. So I think we have to accept that, that it is a historical possibility for people to enact a different kind of future from the one that we know happened, right? So, but that then places a lot of emphasis on the subjective elements, which can lead to perhaps like overly harsh conclusions on the actors. And I think one of the strengths in this book is Roediger's sensitivity in dealing with these questions and his way of empathizing with people who are presented with these dilemmas. And he uses tragic to think this through. Perhaps doesn't, he makes reference to Raymond Williams, but I think it would be, I would be interested in exactly what he understands by tragic, what he means by tragic. Because you can have an understanding of tragedy, I suppose what we're taught in school when we read like Hamlet or something like that, that tragedy is a story where, because of fatal flaws that are inherent to individuals that can't be changed, all you're able to do is just act out your fate. You can't do anything to change it. So tragedy is the inevitable, sad ending. And it doesn't seem like Roediger is pushing that kind of reading. Instead, the tragedy, which if I understand Williams correctly, and it's quite possible that I don't, is more to do with the fact that possibilities are raised by human activity. So humans act on the world around them. They try to change it for the better. And it's the very fact that they make that into a historical possibility. They make that plausible, that it's falling apart, often to do with like human failings. That's where the tragedy comes from. In a sense, like it's not, if something inevitably is doomed to fail, then it's almost not that tragic that it fails. You're back to that whole question of like progress of Marx. The tragedy would be if somehow human beings are never able to consummate their destiny as socialists or whatever. But that the past defeats are not tragic because they're necessary for progress to march on. So I think that tragedy is an interesting way of thinking about this, and it also helps to explain like these very subjective, very individual dilemmas that people like Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony are faced with as revolutionary time starts to wane. So Douglass famously opts to stand by the amendment or support the amendment that gives Black men voting rights in the South, but which doesn't give suffrage to women. And this is seen as a betrayal of the women's rights movement. Douglas had been a champion and would continue to be a champion of women's rights literally until the day he died, as he's at a women's rights rally on the day that he died. Likewise, women's activists, faced with what they see as parting of the ways between abolitionism and women's rights, then make very unsavory alliances with racist Southern Democrats in a bid, to argue for women's suffrage by arguing for the greater capacity of educated white women over the black men who had just been emancipated and given the vote. So this tragedy rebounds in different ways, right? And perhaps it's deliberate of Roediger to leave it somewhat nebulous in his understanding of it, because in some ways this tragedy seems to be about objective conditions. In some ways it seems to be about the fact that these possibilities that are raised aren't fully realized. And partly it's about the individual dilemmas that people are faced with. And because, either way they turn is imperfect and seemingly leads to defeat, that's, I suppose what you'd call a tragic dilemma. Again, like there are resonances here with what happened in Spain, with what happened in Russia. Spain, the case that, as I mentioned, it was particularly thinking about these, the way alliances come together and then fall apart. In reading Season Freedom, that was so influential to me when I was writing my own book, because it seemed to me that the revolutionary time brought about in Spain at the beginning of the Civil War also created opportunities for the seemingly impossible to be realized. And one of the ways that was enacted was through the effect it had on women and the shaking up of gender roles in a country that, until the eve of the revolution, basically, it was rare to see women on the streets without a chaperone. And then, within days, it's common to see women with weapons on barricades, commandeering buildings and things like this. And yet, when revolutionary time wanes, you have on the one hand, objective assaults on this level of equality from the counter-revolution, right? Like the Republican counter-revolution targets women's equal participation in the revolution very early on. It's also experienced as a subjective tragedy. There's a very moving part of the book Pioneras y Revolucionarias, which is a work of oral history by Eulalia Vega, where she interviews, I think it's Concha Perez, who had fought on the front line, a young anarchist from Barcelona, who said that what hurt most about being sent away from the front line, being pressured to leave the anarchist militias, was that it had been her own anarchist colleagues who she thought were committed to emancipation for all, people like Durruti, Ortiz, who had, encouraged her to leave the front. I think that sort of brings home the way in which that tragedy is reenacted in circumstances that are at once very different and at once, comparable as well.
It's really interesting for me to hear you talk about this book as an influence on yours, because, I found those parallels to be apparent as well, that you do a similar job to Roediger here in explaining or, kind of imagining this revolutionary moment and its unraveling, all the while, showing how there's never a sense that it was always going to be that way. It had to go along a certain trajectory. And there are, many historians of the Spanish Civil War and Revolution who will have this analysis that it was always thus and it will always have been this way. It would have played out in this way. And you can see similar things in some of the historiography. And I think, what both you and Roediger are doing are saying, well, no, first of all, we need to remember and not, as you said earlier, do violence to the memory of the revolutionary moment itself. And we need to keep alive those moments and that time. But also to stress, yes, these groups did do these things that did help to unravel the revolution that they themselves put forward. But that isn't the same thing as saying they were always going to do that and they always will. It's talking about failure, you might say, or tragedy in this way, but retaining that sense that it's not a closing down of this forever or in the past either. It's different things could have happened, things could have gone another way, not least because, again, as we've said, the unexpected happened. So who are we as historians to say that what we would then expect to happen couldn't have, and that everything was always foretold to play out in the way it was, because it demonstrably wasn't the case.
I think we should be clear about what the political implications of these kind of histories are as well. You know, these kind of complacent histories that want us to believe that everything was always going to play out the way it did. You know, it's saying, you know, whether consciously or not, that the same applies today. That people who are taking a chance, who are risking their lives in the case of the Black Lives Matter protests in the States, are pissing in the wind, essentially, right? That the future that is preordained for us, and the best thing that we can do is look to the correct authorities to manage it in as painless way as possible. And obviously, if we go along with that kind of logic, then we are doomed as a species, right? And this is what revolutionary history helps us to understand, I think, and get in perspective as well.
Thanks for listening. You can find links to a range of the materials mentioned in this podcast in the notes to the episode. As ever, you can follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook at ABC Danny and Jim, and get in touch via our email abcwithdannyandjim@gmail.com. The podcast music is Stealing Orchestra, Gente de Miña Terra. The podcast logo is an adapted version of the Left Book Club logo, and the image in this episode is Winslow Homer's Near Andersonville from 1866, which Roediger discusses in Seizing Freedom, and is available in the public domain. Love and solidarity. Until next time.